Welcome to the Mitchell Hamlin Law Journal of Public Policy and Practice podcast, brought to you by the student run and student edited journal at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. Founded in 1976, our journal is dedicated to excellence through diligence, not exclusivity. And now we're thrilled to bring that mission to the airwaves. My name is Maggie, and I'm the editor in chief of the journal.
And I'm Ashley, the public policy editor. Today, we have Professor Natalie Netzel with us, and she is, I think I'm allowed to say this, a boss lady of the legal profession. She's the director of the clinical legal education at Mitchell Hamlin and a board member of Minnesota Lawyers for Concerned Lawyers. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for making this podcast. I think you all are just incredible what you're doing.
Oh, you're too nice. So, you recently published an article in the Bar and Bench on moral injury. And just to give our listeners a definition, moral injury occurs when a person in high stakes situations perpetuates or witness to or fails to prevent actions that violate their deeply held moral beliefs, resulting in lasting psychological, spiritual, and social harm. And I mean, the article was incredibly powerful. To talk about this kind of subject was amazing. I think it was so insightful. Essentially, we're talking about the lasting psychic harm that arises when professionals must do things that violate their core values. I mean, what inspired you to look inward and explore your experience with moral injury?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work with trauma and with vicarious trauma, with mental health, with lawyer well-being more generally. But I kept having this experience that I didn't really quite have a name for. And I came across the term moral injury, and I think I actually first heard it from Miriam Itzkowitz, who is a licensed clinical social worker that was working in our clinics with me, notably not a lawyer. So then when I started to dive into well, what is moral injury? I saw that it's discussed by other disciplines. It starts with the military, law enforcement, educators, social workers, medical professionals, especially during the pandemic. There's a bunch of literature discussing moral injury as it relates to all of these other professions. But the legal profession, there was just kind of a void in what was written. There's nothing really written about moral injury in the law, despite some pretty clear parallels to those other professions. And to me, what felt like, oh, this is light bulb went off. This is so obviously what I'm feeling. So it was helpful for me to understand challenging experiences that I had through the lens of moral injury. And then knowing that there was a void in the literature, I wanted to be able to kind of illustrate the experience for lawyers, educate them about it with a hope that by naming it and then collectively addressing the issue that we might heal from it or even prevent more severe moral injury from happening.
In your article, you describe moral injury as a wound to the conscience. How does that differ from the typical burnout that lawyers talk about?
Yeah, so I think as lawyers, we often use burnout as an umbrella term to refer to distress that we experience in law. I also think that we need much more precise language around the root causes of our suffering to better tailor how we talk about it and how we heal from it and how we address it. So, if burnout, might be characterized for some as stress from overwork. Well, reducing a workload might be a fix, and it might not lead necessarily to lasting harm. I might feel burnt out when I'm grading my 140th final exam, but that's just oh, I'm doing a lot of work right now, and then I'm going to be done. And then I'm going to be fine. And that wasn't a traumatizing experience. It was just a lot of work in a short period of time. But when the kind of suffering that lawyers are experiencing or that I'm experiencing when the cause of it is carrying the weight of being a public citizen with a special responsibility for the quality of justice at a time when there's attacks on lawyers and law and judges and aspects of democracy and the rule of law that we pledge to uphold are crumbling. Merely reducing a workload or a spa day or a vacation is not going to really fix that underlying harm. And then going kind of above and beyond, when so many of the problems that we face as lawyers, even our own problems are systemic. Having the healing options that are suggested to us be just individual fixes, it leaves the burden of healing from systemic harm on individuals who are suffering. And this feels like unfair and impractical at best, but in many situations, I think actually causes additional harm when the kind of cure does not actually address the cause.
Yeah. And I like what you said that, lawyers really want to use this umbrella term, burnout. And I think that's what's really difficult is I feel like lawyers really, as we don't really know and understand how to define what we're feeling as something deeper. I
Yeah.
mean, how would you, because I think that's what's tough is when you're in the profession, like, how do you know that what you're feeling isn't maybe just compassion fatigue? Like, how do you know that this is something deeper than what is burnout, you know? It's such an easy term for us to just turn to.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that we can experience multiple things at the same time. And so we can experience, burnout, vicarious trauma, and moral injury at the very same time. But for me, there was a time where like my self care practices were pretty good. I had made changes to have a more manageable workload to address just like ongoing stress. I had done a lot of writing and teaching on the topic of vicarious trauma, and I understood both the risk of exposure to graphic materials of others, the risks that were posed to me. I had tools to address that. But as I was representing families in the child welfare system, I kept having to explain, like, well, yeah, it's like vicarious trauma is hard. It's hard to be exposed to these really traumatic situations that brought families into the legal system. But I can deal with that. It's the harm that the system is imposing on them that is harmful to me. Because even worse, I'm playing a role in upholding the harmful systems. And those actions then are taking kind of a there's like psychic numbing to kind of help me deal with like what I was doing every day to make it seem normal and okay. And it was like, oh, this is like so much deeper than, just burnout or just vicarious trauma. And, for me, we use the term compassion fatigue often. Also, though, there's times where compassion feels like the anecdote. Like,
Yeah.
by having compassion, that heals me, and, and and so, yeah, that was just kind of, like, an interesting, like, aside on kind of what is the cause, but what also can, like, be the solution.
Yeah. I love that.
I feel like one of the main characteristics that lawyers have is that they really identify as problem solvers and advocates for the rule of law. Um, how does that identity tend to clash with the emotional and kind of moral dissonance you describe?
Yeah, what a great question. So when I wrote the article, I focused a lot on harms that I feel like I have caused by upholding a system that is unjust. What I don't address in the article, but what feels very present to me today in conversations that I have is right, like as the Trump administration is kind of attacking the rule of law and lawyers are kind of rightfully deeply disturbed by that. I find myself really reconciling the fact that it's, I'm so disturbed at the attacks on the rule of law. And I think that we're more aware of the attacks on the rule of now because like big firms and academic institutions and all these entities that hold so much privilege are being attacked too. And at the same time, I've consistently watched and participated in the rule of law consistently being used to harm the marginalized. And so I felt this moral dissonance kind of simultaneously being both disturbed by the attacks on the rule of law and also being disturbed by the way the rule of law attacks people. And that feels like a lot to carry. I don't have like a good answer of how to like make sense of that right now, but it's like both things are true at the same time.
And I think what I really enjoyed about your article is that you mentioned that moral injury can happen even when lawyers act ethically. And I think that's so fascinating because when you think about this distinction, the ethical but morally painful, um, Why is it so hard for us in the profession to talk about that?
I mean, I think that the conversation on moral injury necessitates us taking more responsibility for our professionally sanctioned actions that cause harm. I think that vicarious trauma is an easier pill to swallow because, in kind of addressing vicarious trauma, we're saying, like, I'm impacted by being exposed by harm that comes to others. And that's like a noble thing, right? Like, there's like, you can like martyr yourself within that. But moral injury involves more of a reckoning. I'm harmed by the harm I cause as a lawyer, that I'm allowed to and required to cause within my role. Or I'm harmed when I make a mistake as a lawyer and fail to do something that I should have done. I'm harmed by that harm that I cause, or the harm that I didn't prevent, or the harm that I felt responsible for something and I kind of bore witness to that. Um, and I think that that's a really kind of a much stickier place to be, and I think it's why we struggle with addressing it.
Professor, I would love to get your thoughts on the current legal ethics framework that we have. Do you think that this framework tends to help or hinder lawyers in acknowledging moral injury?
Yeah, so I think that we need an ethical framework, and I think that the ethical framework that we have is a sound one. But I think that we are scared to talk about our mistakes. I think that we are scared to talk about the way that our processes cause harm. I think that it's not the framework in and of itself that's the problem, but it's the lack of kind of space and vulnerability that we kind of collectively allow ourselves to have. I think that's maybe kind of more of the place where we could fix the problems. It's not like having ethics. Because a lot of times, right, when I'm acting ethically, I'm also acting morally. There's just also times where that conflicts a little bit.
And I think I really loved in your article, you start talking about, advising parents to voluntarily terminate their parental rights. And I think how do lawyers reconcile kind of the tension and when doing that? I think or can you? I think that's such a difficult we don't talk about these kind of difficult choices as lawyers that we have to make.
Yeah. So, essentially the way that kind of the law is, especially in Minnesota, there are times where legally it is absolutely the best option for someone to voluntarily terminate their parental rights because they have like a chance at remaining in contact with their child if they do it voluntarily, or they won't have a future unborn child or child yet to be born removed from them immediately upon birth if it's voluntarily versus involuntary. So the law is incredibly coercive. And when I advise my clients on the law and say, like, your best legal option is to voluntarily terminate your rights, I am, you know, doing something that feels coercive. At the same time, in showing up in a way that, I strive to kind of address trauma within the attorney client relationship, and I'm, able to sit with their pain, make the process feel better for them, listening to them and providing them options on their choices and really kind of respecting what they have to say. There's times where I've had enough humility to really trust my clients when I say, well, I think that we're going to lose at trial. And when we lose at trial, here's what I think that you're going to lose. I think this is a really risky choice, and I would strongly advise we don't take this option. And my clients say, like, no, I'm good. And I'm so glad that in those moments, that I was still able to, like, despite kind of acting in a way advising in a way that felt coercive, be like, okay, but that's not my decision to make. Let's have the trial. Especially because there's times where I won some of those trials that I thought were unwinnable. And I was like, well, thank goodness that I didn't rush to push this. Um, and, I don't know that making a process that's coercive better for someone necessarily addresses the harm, but it certainly is kind of better than treating the process in a way that, like, is less emotionally supportive. I don't know. I still grapple with that and like the right way to operate in these systems.
Yeah.
Within your article, you wrote about, quote, feeling like a monster. And when I read that, I felt that that was just so powerful and just a very vulnerable phrase. Um, and I really feel that the legal profession kind of sets us up to be almost like these emotionless monsters. How do you think that how do you think shame operates in the legal profession? Do you think it plays a dominant role in keeping lawyers silent about their pain?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this kind of question hits the nail on the head about kind of the shame that we have that we don't have space to talk about. And admittedly, right, I was quite nervous to write this article. And I write vulnerable things all the time. I've written about kind of mental health, I've written about vicarious trauma and my own experiences there. But this one was harder because of the amount of shame involved. Because it's not just like a bad thing happened to me or a bad thing happened and I saw it and it impacted me. It's recognizing like I am owning doing things that didn't feel right to me at the time. And I'm going to put it in print for everyone to read. Um, and I am in like the most privileged position possible as a professor with of employment where like it's hard to fire me and it's kind of my job to say controversial things. Even then, sharing's not easy. And so I think that we need to kind of meet each other with more compassion and grace and less judgment. And having less judgment is hard for us as lawyers in these conversations. And then, another place that it was challenging or that there was kind of shame built in is that like my moral injury might kind of contradict moral injury that other people experience. And so, I don't mean to, or I have a fear that when I talk about kind of the moral injury I experience, that somehow is casting judgment on like a county attorney who has a different role in the system, who feels as if they are doing the right things within their roles. And at times they might feel that they fall short in different ways by like failing, by failing to achieve a termination of parental rights. They might experience moral injury like they messed up and didn't protect a child, while at the very same time, my kind of the alleviating of my moral injury by going in and being able to get the outcome a client wants, is maybe at kind of a cost of theirs. And kind of how do we, within these big complicated systems, reconcile that? And yeah, that's where kind of compassion really is an antidote to alleviating shame for ourselves and others.
It almost feels like for those in the profession that we kind of feel like maybe we're bystanders to that kind of injury, like, and that's why we have to be these like pillars of strength. Is like, well, I didn't commit the crime, but I'm trying to help this person the best I can. And I think almost like that is kind of where it's this weird like, well, I don't deserve to feel this way because it's like I'm, you know, in some way it's a little bit it's hard. Do you
It's like
think
how much of our own emotions do we get to own in the experience? How
yeah.
much of our own humanity plays out in the experience? And, we're taught that somehow we can be divorced from that, or implicitly taught that somehow we can be divorced from that. But the reality of it's so intertwined and, you know, we're at times complicit in harms that like the system, which is not something that is the system is made up of people. It's made up of us. We're not separate in any way, shape, or form from the system as much as we might like to think that we are.
I'm glad you caught on exactly to what I was trying to say. And I did not say it in so elegant terms, but that's exactly. And yeah, that is, I that's great to be able to kind of formulate that, we're not divorced from that system. Do you think your understanding of moral injury has evolved through your work and reflection since writing this?
Yeah, it absolutely has. I feel like I've been really lucky to get to have many conversations about this topic with people across practice areas. And I find that it is resonating in ways that are unexpected to me. Like I, talked with someone who's a city attorney, a civil city attorney. And, that attorney was saying, oh, well, the vicarious trauma stuff doesn't really resonate with me. I don't, get a lot of vicarious trauma, but moral injury, like having to like uphold laws or rules that don't align with my personal values, that really resonates. And I was like, huh, like I was, just thinking about my public defenders and my family defense attorneys and like, my prosecutors, and judges. Like I was thinking about that group, but gosh, there's, folks who are, maybe like representing or kind of engaging in like transactional law that like might like cause harm to the environment. And they're just, helping draft the contract, but how it's like kind of resonated with them too. So kind of the depth of the possibility of moral injury has really evolved in my understanding. And another way that my understanding has really evolved, is that we need to do more than just issue spot this problem. And we as lawyers are really good issue spotters. But what I think we actually need is kind of collective healing and responsibility for the issue in places where it's safe to process moral injury collectively to reduce that shame, to do it together. And we have a kind of a huge void in literature about knowing like what actually works to address moral injury. And I hope to kind of do some empirical research to understand that issue, because that's where the actual healing will come, is when we understand the solutions, even better than we understand the problem.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even think about like the fact that there's just no solution to this. It's definitely changes your like perspective, like wow.
Yeah, I mean, like, things like therapy and, medication and like self-care practices and like all of those things are going to help alleviate symptoms of moral injury. I'm kind of interested in how do we alleviate, and all of those things are good, but they only get us so far. Yeah. So how do we like, reduce kind of moral injury to more of just like a risk of moral stress? And to the extent that we're going to experience moral stress as lawyers, that's normal. And actually, to me, seems like sign of like we all have healthy moral consciences. Like there is like moral integrity in feeling some amount of moral stress. So it's not like we're ever going to be free from the stress that comes up when we're in, situations addressing morality. But to the extent that it leads to, severe mental health issues and increases like risk of suicide, like all of those things, we need better solutions.
Yeah. I also think it's so important to like have these conversations because I really do think it helps better our relationship with the law
Yeah.
and being able to kind of address like this is why I feel this way. You just
Yeah.
don't typically get those. So
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a really important conversation to be had, especially with people who are either entering the legal field or are, relatively new to the legal field. So, Professor, if you could speak directly to a young attorney or a law student who is listening to this podcast, who feels damned if they stay, damned if they leave, what would you say to them?
Yeah. So I'd say it's not about being perfect. Law school fuels our perfectionist tendencies. There's also great research out there to show that perfectionist tendencies don't help us as lawyers. Really great research that shows that perfectionist tendencies actually make us like perform worse as lawyers. I think that the intersection of perfectionism and moral injury, is a particularly damning one, because when we feel the need to set the standard, like we have to be perfect in how we are lawyers addressing, the moral harms caused, it's better to show up imperfectly than not show up at all. You can always change course when something feels wrong. You can use kind of your kind of moral conscience as a guide. Where do you lean in? Where do you take a step back? Where do you speak out? And where do you just like decide not to engage in a certain action, even if those around you are doing it. Um, and that's going to be an imperfect journey, and that's okay. Like our humanity, inherently we are imperfect within our humanity, and don't think that you have to do this perfectly.
I love that. I think as students, we all really struggle with this concept of perfection. I think for so many of us, it's hard to like even move on from assignments because we're still thinking about like, oh God, maybe I didn't catch all those issues. So I love hearing that. As for us students, as we kind of enter into this profession, how do you think we can better honor the humanity of lawyers without kind of weakening our commitment to justice?
Yeah, I think that the more humanity we allow ourselves as lawyers, and the more humanity that we uh, allow each other, that justice is going to be strengthened. And I don't know that I see those things inherently being opposed to one another, because I think that, the better that we care for ourselves and for each other, we then influence the systems that we're a part of, and the systems will become better when we feel better. And the inverse is true. When systems are better, we will feel better because there won't be as many harms imposed. So it's this really like symbiotic relationship between the quality of justice and the humanity of the individual lawyer. And if we can kind of make that connection, um, that's how I think that we help to make things better at both an individual and a systemic level.
Yeah. Wow. So before we end today, sorry, do you have anything else you want to share?
Um, I guess, just kind of as a follow-up, like I'm happy to kind of continue these conversations. So if you're, a student who's listening, who's, concerned about this kind of thing, I teach a class called Resilient Practice, where we get to really talk about these topics and issues. And even kind of outside of that class that we teach, like I'm happy to continue the conversation offline, and y'all know where to find me.
I will say I took your criminal class as a 1L, and I always thought it was really amazing how you kind of intertwined these discussions while we were learning, your typical 1L criminal course. And I thought it was always just so, so incredible. So I thank you for that. I think it's always so great to have a professor who talks about these things and is so open, because I think it really does help students just prepare for what we're going to face in the real world when we, go out there. So thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you for you and your classmates being students who are open to this, because it really is. It's that symbiotic relationship. And yeah, it was so great to have you in class, Ashley.
Oh, thank you. She says that now. But back then, I probably was annoying with all my questions. So
Not even. I love questions.
Well, thank you all for tuning in to the Mitchell Hamlin School of Law Journal of Public Policy and Practice podcast. We hope this episode sparked your curiosity and deepened your understanding of the legal and policy challenges we face, and hopefully prepared you a little bit more for when we go out and practice. Thank you.